Just what could the cost be for the UK of a Brexit no deal on trade? And what is the UK's trade policy looking ahead? Now, we've had a white paper out this week looking at the free trade policy of the UK post-Brexit in terms of a no deal. The UK calling themselves they're going to be global champions of free trade, very much global Britain strategy. Joining me is Stephen Woolfe, Richard Corbett and Matt Carthy to talk this through. Matt, let's start with you. This concept of the UK wanting to be global champions of free trade, that is what they can achieve after Brexit, when they're liberated from the shackles, arguably, of the EU. How does that sound to you? How does that read to people in Europe?
I think it sounds what it is, absurd to say we're going to be champions of free trade yet cut ourselves off from the market that's closest to us. I think it will be particularly worrying, or if it's not, it should be particularly worrying for farmers, for example, for people whose livelihoods depend on protections that are put in place as a result of being members of the European Union. And particularly alarm bells should be ringing for anybody across the north of Ireland, regardless of what way they voted, because effectively what the British government are saying by even contemplating the type of strategy that is now being discussed is that the Irish economy, north and south, will be thrown to the wolves. Okay,
Stephen, you are obviously someone who voted for Brexit. Mm. Is this the right way of going about it? This sort of free market, liberal view of the globe and how the Britain can pitch itself in terms of business afterwards?
I think those.
Do you not see any risks of perhaps irritating?
I think those who've looked at the modern free trade arguments, whether they're in a customs union that you've got here in the European Union, or the idea that there's free trade agreements, have seen that free trade has increased the wealth of the world's population since the mid-1940s and early 50s. And with that in principle, the question you have to ask yourself is the models that we have today, are they the ones that are encouraging growth to continue, or are they restricting it? And I came to the conclusion that we have free trade arrangements, a customs union and a single market that we have today, or protectionism to the level that you might be argued Trump wants to go to. And it's the former, the free trade arrangement, is the modern version of what we should be looking for, and the others are now ideas of the past, just like one of those great big old mobile phones from Motorola. We're moving on to the Apple or the Samsung of the future and moving away from the past ideals.
But surely someone with a European outlook would say the EU is a great example of global free trade. An interaction across the globe, but just on a regional level rather on the nation-state level.
I always argued at the beginning of the kind of project, as they call it, that when they removed the tariffs particularly in steel and coal, and moved on into the other 6 nations and reducing those barriers, then that was perfectly fine. But what I've argued over the time, particularly since the late 70s, around 78, 79, moving on through the mid-80s, the increasing protectionist element of the European Union is what started to see the decline then and was emphasised at the back end of the 80s into the 90s.
Okay, Richard, do you buy that idea of the EU becoming more protectionist? Actually, it's the inverse of what a global free trading regional bloc should look like. It's becoming far more insular, far more looking after number one rather than anything else.
No, I don't think so. It has more free trade agreements than the USA does with the rest of the world. And that's the problem for Britain. If it leaves the EU, it's not just a matter of making trade with its main export market much more difficult. It's a matter of handicapping our trade with the rest of the world, because at the moment we have trade deals with countries across the globe that we've negotiated via the EU. Why do we negotiate as Europe? Because we have more clout in those negotiations. It's the world's largest market. We get concessions, we get access to other agreements. If we now exit that, tear up those agreements, have to negotiate our own ones, coming along just as Britain alone and having to negotiate simultaneously with countries across the whole planet, desperate, in a hurry to replace what existed before, we're not going to get any good deals.
Well, the argument could be that you could negotiate a far more bespoke, specialised free trade arrangement with other countries. Indeed, if you look at Australia, the signals from countries like Australia is that they're very much keen on.
Very theoretical. Australia is now giving priority to its deeper trade deal with the EU, by the way, and told us to wait.
We had the same story with Japan as well.
So much for that one. But there's a theoretical idea, we can have a bespoke agreement, just what we need, and the other countries will give us just what we want. You'll be negotiating for that, and negotiating just as Britain without the clout, the leverage we had when we negotiated as Europe for the deals we already have in the bag. A bird in the hand is worth more than 2 in the bush.
Matt, what do you think of this idea of, and this has come out today past few days, I should say, the idea that if Brexit doesn't work in terms of the union negotiations, somehow the UK could pivot towards Canada, the US, Mexico, NAFTA, start engaging with those kind of markets rather than wasting time with perhaps an EU who's not apparently interested. Do you buy that as a possibility?
I think the British government should call their trade strategy DAFTA, because it is that, it's daft, to suggest that they would be in a position to negotiate the type of trade deals that would arguably require to even make up a fraction of what they would lose by leaving the customs union and the single market. Again, I'm no fan of the European Commission's current trade agenda. In fact, I consider it to be a very regressive trade agenda that's actually not protectionist. In fact, it's a corporate charter. It's been driven very much by the largest multinationals in the world. It's pivoted on an investment court that allows governments effectively to be sued for implementing decisions that corporations don't like. But I do believe in the principle that there should be trading relations between countries, but that it be on the basis that we give countries what they can't produce themselves, and we get from them products that they can't produce.
But you can still achieve in free trade arrangements.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not opposed to the concept of free trade. In fact, coming from Ireland, we're probably the most open economy in Europe. We probably the best trading relationship in terms of a relative terms than any EU member state. We've managed to do all of that without ever having a single investment court or ISDS system in place. So it is possible. The problem is whether the British government can do that and negotiate those type of trade deals from a position of extreme weaknesses, which is where they are. And I have to say, if I was involved in business, particularly a small or a medium business, either in Britain or in the north of Ireland, I'd be very concerned about.
I mean, just to provide some context, this was plans being considered by ministers in the UK reportedly as this radical plan B in the event of a hard Brexit and the EU not playing ball in any shape on a free trade arrangement. The US, Canada and Mexico and the UK combined gross domestic product of 17.2 trillion versus the EU GDP of about 15.7 trillion. So there's a significant market there, arguably, which could be tapped into, Stephen.
There's a huge market that we can go to, and if you look at the United States, 25% of US FDI is in the UK. And
could it compensate, though, for the loss of an EU?
No, my point about it is in terms of the United States, when you come to these agreements that Richard was talking about between the EU and the US and other countries, those countries are looking at the UK as being the most significant player alongside that of Germany. So when you take those two out, it actually weakens the overall plans of the European Union. But what that means is, if Britain gets it right, and I'm not suggesting at the moment that we are getting right, I think some elements are good, some elements are bad.
What's the worst element so far? What's the thing that's making you particularly frustrated?
My particular frustration is that we're agreeing to the principle that we can't even start negotiating free trade arrangements with other countries whilst we're in an EU. And we've got the negotiation with the EU and allowing them to restrict us on that. And when I've been out to the United States, those involved in the State Department or involved in trade are deeply concerned and worried. Why can't we just get on with it now? Because they want to get on with it now and they feel restricted. And that's my biggest concern about this.